What's going on, guys? Welcome to another recap of Convicting a Murderer, episode 5, and we're going to break down the Manitowoc involvement, the $36 million Steven Avery narrative unraveled by Candace Owens in Convicting a Murderer, episode 5 description. Corbin and Link's participation in Avery's $36 million lawsuit was apparently enough motivation for them to be accused of planting evidence, but their involvement, along with all of Manitowoc County's support in the investigation, wasn't the full story. Folks, you can catch episodes of Convicting a Murderer Thursdays on the DailyWire Plus. In 2025, Netflix took a look at the case of Steven Avery in their docuseries Making a Murderer. They explored Avery and how corrupt law enforcement made him quite possibly innocent. The series became one of the streaming giant's biggest series. Fast forward to now, Candace Owens on a mission to set the record straight in the Daily Wire Plus series Convicting a Murderer. We are on to episode 5 of the 10-episode series. So let's go ahead. I'm going to share my thoughts. What I do with these each and every week, I take some running notes of some bits and pieces of the episode of what I thought were intriguing. I might not capture everything that you might hear in the episode, but sometimes that happens when I'm watching the episode. I'm just taking kind of running notes. But we kind of pick up right where we left off with Ken Kravitz, the special prosecutor, talking about his upcoming meeting with Andy. Now, I will start by saying this. The conversation between Ken and Andy, having those war words, I kind of expected a little bit more from that conversation. We do see bits and pieces throughout the episode, but I was kind of expecting more of a breakdown of these on this, and we didn't kind of get that, but that's okay. All right, moving right along. Jim Haggerty talked about Making a Murder and how, when watching it, the uncertainty of if Steven Avery was guilty. The creators talked about how they left so much open and they weren't going to close the door. And it wasn't their job to figure it all out. That's what they said on a radio show. Jim talked about watching it and thinking the cops had missed the mark. Tom Fassbender, the DCI former agent, talked about getting the phone call about how Teresa's car had been found. They begin to talk about how Manitowoc County had turned over the case because of the conflict of interest as a result of the pending case with Steven Avery and the department. Andy, of course, talked about how the county hid the facts they were involved in the case, followed by saying they were the ones finding the evidence themselves. Now, of course, that was the biggest thing that Netflix pointed out in Making the Murderer, was how Colburn and Link, who were Manitowoc County officers, were the ones that continuously kept on finding the evidence in the case. So that built their case of, hey, they're trying to frame him so they don't have to make any payments, right? So Manitowoc County was supporting Calumet's, but not leading the investigating. The viewers in Making a Murder were kind of given the idea that they completely bowed out of the investigation, which wasn't true. Calumet led the investigation with Manitowoc County kind of chiming in. As we all know, this Steven Avery lot was massive, right? So this entire thing, the investigating, this is not a super big county. So there's not 150,000 officers available to their disposal. So of course, Manitowoc County was eligible, had to come in and pitch in where they needed to. Manitowoc was allowed to investigate, but the Manitowoc DA ordered that Manitowoc officers be accompanied at all times, so there would be no perceived conflict of interest throughout the entire time about the $36 million lawsuit. We see Earl standing there talking about how he was unable to see Teresa's car, nor did he know that the car was on the Avery lot. It was covered in plywood and branches to hide it. Brendan talked to the investigators about how he and Steven covered the car. One of the things that I fascinating about this is in this time frame of finding the car, not finding the car, like why would he cover it up, right? That's been the big plural thing. But my crazy thing about it is it's covered up with stuff there. You know what I mean? Like I don't know, the case for the idea of somebody else doing it's definitely interesting. Andy and Ken are both talking about the car and where it was at. Ken perfectly says that Steven needed that car found, but having it found covered by only equally suspicious. The problem with Steven's case was, who cares that it was found on Avery's lot? Finding it on Avery's lot does not make Avery guilty. It being covered on his lot makes it equally as suspicious, right? And then, of course, the license plate on Teresa's car was not even brought up in Making of the Murder. But here, the plates for the RAV4 were found folded up in thirds in a station wagon on the other side of the yard from the location of the vehicle. Behind the fence is Avery's salvage yard, closer to Steven Avery's trailer. That is something completely left out of the Making of the Murderer. Him taking the license plate off of the vehicle wasn't great for Avery. It didn't make any sense. If you're going to have the car and you're going to hide the car, you might as well keep the license plate with it. It doesn't make any sense, because when people go search for a car, you can run the VIN number, and this guy should know these things, right? This goes to show you that this is not a smart individual that's trying to, again, he just thought that he could do the bare minimum and get away with murder here, right? Jim, in a montage of the testimony, are talking about finding some blood in the car via dogs, so they protected the car instead of investigating at the point to avoid any potential criticism versus doing it at that point because the defense having a case. This is a common theme that we talk about throughout this episode. They talked about how they needed to use Manitowoc County, even though they were criticized because of the amount of cars that needed to be searched on the Avery's lot. They didn't have very many cops, and the DCI weren't evidence people. So the Manitowoc County and Calumet people had to work together. They do a search. They said they didn't rip the place apart inside Avery's place, right? So they get the call. They're going to do they're going to search Avery's lot. They found blood, carpet cleaner, pornography, vacuum, handcuffs. They took the handcuffs because they were uncertain if they were used. Jim sent another team in, but the first team didn't know that the second team was going to come in after them, right? Because, again, you're running with the idea that if the wrong people find the right things, then they're going to exploit that. You know what I mean? You're processing an investigation here, right? So if they were going to plant something, they would have done it at this particular moment, okay? I will be first to say it would never surprise me in a million years if the cops had planted evidence. We've seen it happen before. But in this case, using this as a tool against Colburn and Link was a stretch of an imagination here. I understand there's $36 million lawsuit at stake, but again, why would these cops, and you know, Candace Owens said it perfect, why would these officers risk their lives and their own livelihoods, their own freedom to frame a man that somebody else might avoid, that somebody else might avoid paying a lawsuit? The Making of the Murder creators saw an opportunity and pounced on it because of the deposition, right? And he talked about them being dirty, and now they're involved in this suspicious case from some man. Now, this is the crazy thing. All right. So this is where they kind of blurred that line of uncertainty of what was going on, right? So we're dissecting it. Obviously, Colburn had gotten this phone call back in 1995. The problem with this is when he got that phone call, right? They said in 95, Colburn got the phone call from a man who said he was a detective from an agency. That detective said he didn't provide any more information. That man said that a man was in jail who may have committed a crime that someone else was in prison for. Now, why in the world would Colburn offer any more things right there? Like, in this instance, how many calls do you think this man transferred, right? How in the world is this a gotcha moment that Netflix made it out to be? Seriously, as somebody that answers phone calls on a day-to-day basis, if it's not an issue that pertains to me, if they're calling me and telling me something about something and say that they're working, they want to talk to the bigger boss about it, I'm flushing that down the toilet and moving on to the next phone call. It's the most absurd thing that I had ever seen. Another thing, the Steven Avery lawsuit, he accepted a $400,000 settlement of the $36 million, and they lay it out if they went to court in order for them to prove the case. They didn't really have it in their corner to win that case. It's wild that the settlement kind of happened at $400,000, but we never really hear about the $400,000. It's $36 million. The lawyers knew what they were getting themselves into. They knew what they had to prove. They had to have proved that these officers framed Steven Avery without a shadow of a doubt to get a settlement. So instead of being able to do that, these lawyers got as much money as they could out of the police station and got that. I don't know. Breaking the Murder cut out Dean Strang's opening statement that were only that they were only witnesses. We get a side-by-side of that again. Both were pulled into the lawsuit, not as defendants, as witnesses. They removed any indication that they were the only called as witnesses. Colborne and Link weren't going to lose anything. Like, they had nothing to lose here at all. Colborne talked about how he was happy for Steven Avery because nobody wanted to be in prison for something they didn't do. Again, what does Colborne have to gain by planting evidence, by saying this, by saying that? Nothing at all. 2 days before Teresa is found, they did a general search of the garage where they found shells from a shotgun and some blood-like stains. Brenda, the producer, said is heading to talk to Ron, who was an investigator who took pictures of Teresa's car. They talked about how Corbin, Link, and another detective went back to Avery's trailer, and if they missed anything. It was Tom's idea to have them search the entire place thoroughly instead this time. So obviously they did a small search, just whatever kind of stood out to them. This time we're doing a thorough, we're moving things out of the way, we're finding things. Of course, Colborne joked in this moment about how frustrated it was to have to go back in there and do this again. They didn't want to have to go in there with more stuff. Obviously, this is when Link found the key from the floor that moved the lights in that Colborne had moved. As a result, the key being found, of course, it was tied to Reese's car. It was the RAV4 key. And this is where everyone started to question whether or not Avery was being framed. Obviously, Ken Krantz said he was pissed when they found found out that Link and Colborne found the key, because he knew that they were going to utilize this against them in the case. Again, blowback, blowback, blowback. It's such a fascinating, like, this entire thing to me. And I'm saying this. I'm very general. I'm very, very neutral in this situation. I'm trying to learn as much as I can about this case, trying to figure out what is going on between who, what, when, where, and how, right? That to me is where I'm at in this entire investigation. But one day, I hope we get someone from the creators of Making a Murder to explain why they left out key pieces of evidence as they did throughout the entire docuseries. Suppose you take nothing away from Convicting a Murderer, nothing away from it. In that case, it's a simple fact that it didn't present all of the evidence, which ended up being able to spin things the way they wanted it, to put the doubt in the mind that Teresa, what happened to Teresa Hallback and whether or not Steven Avery was framed. That is what the biggest takeaway from this case should be. Why were they so adamant about leaving out important details to make Steven Avery look innocent? Even if in a world that you think that he is innocent, even in a world that he could potentially be innocent, why are you continuously leaving out bits and pieces that could potentially sway people one way or another? That is something that I would love answered at some point down the line. Overall, another fantastic episode breaking down the evidence that is required to ride that line to figuring out what really went down and how Making a Murderer didn't present the whole truth. Again, fantastic episode. Again, following what I need throughout this episode. One is a strong 5 episodes. Very impressed with how it's laid out. Still concerned. We still have 5 more episodes to go. What can we provide in those 5 episodes that we haven't already seen that can present the case of Making a Murderer was made under these weird conditions that they left out things? But excited to dive into episode 6 next week. Thank you guys for continuously tuning in. Thank you for your comments, good, bad, or indifferent. Really enjoying them. Love the healthy conversations. What do you think I missed? What do you think I didn't see? Or maybe I pointed something in the wrong direction. Let me know. These are healthy conversations about things that went down. So thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll talk to you guys next week.